In the spring of 1960, in a village in Anhui province, a woman boiled the leather strap of her sandal and ate it. She'd spent 3 hours softening it over a fire made from furniture. The bark on every tree within walking distance was gone. She'd stripped it herself over the previous weeks, boiled it, eaten it. Her youngest child had died 4 days earlier. She didn't have the strength to bury him. And if you had gone to that same village 2 years before and told her this was coming, she would have laughed. Because 2 years before, that village was alive and loud and full of people making noise. Not music, not celebration, a specific coordinated, state-mandated noise, pots being beaten, tin drums. Thousands of voices shouting at the open sky for hours at a stretch. They were killing sparrows, not as a metaphor, not as folklore. Literally, methodically, on a national quota system, killing sparrows. 2 billion of them over the course of a single year. And what unfolded in the 12 months that followed was not a drought, not a plague in the biblical sense, not an act of God or nature or bad luck. It was something more instructive and more disturbing than any of those things. It was what happens when one man's certainty replaces an entire civilization's ability to ask questions. This is not really a story about sparrows. To understand 1958, you have to understand Mao Zedong's state of mind in 1958. The revolution had succeeded. The nationalist government was gone. The party controlled everything. And yet, China was still poor, still agricultural, still behind, still, in Mao's perception, a country that the world didn't fully respect. He was 64 years old and running out of patience with gradual progress. He wanted transformation, total, visible, undeniable transformation. He called it the Great Leap Forward, and he intended to industrialize China within a generation, to turn a peasant country into a modern power through sheer collective will. The Four Pests campaign was one of the first concrete expressions of that ambition. The four pests were rats, flies, mosquitoes, and Eurasian tree sparrows. The reasoning behind the sparrows was presented as scientific. Sparrows eat grain seeds. China needed grain to feed its population and to export in exchange for industrial equipment. Therefore, sparrows were enemies of the people. Mao announced this at a party gathering, and because it was Mao who announced it, within weeks, it was national policy backed by the full apparatus of the Chinese Communist Party. Not a recommendation, not a voluntary program, a directive with quotas enforced through the same mechanisms that enforced every other directive. Provincial governments assigned targets. City governments broke those targets down to district level. Districts assigned them to schools, factories, farming collectives, and then the competition began. The method was simple and took no equipment beyond whatever noise-making object you had at hand. You found a sparrow. You chased it. When it tried to land, on a branch, on a roof, on the ground, you chased it again. You kept it in the air. Sparrows, like all small birds, have hearts that cannot sustain extended flight under stress. Keep them flying long enough, and they fall out of the sky on their own. Then you collect the body and add it to your count. City blocks were organized like military operations. Shifts of residents stationed at every rooftop, every tree, every potential landing point, working in rotation through the day and night, making sure nothing could rest. School children were given quotas and tracked by homeroom teachers. The child who killed the most sparrows in a week got a red star on the classroom board. A middle school in Beijing reportedly killed over 20,000 birds in 3 days. There are photographs from this period, not rare or obscure ones, published in party newspapers at the time, of children proudly holding up strings of dead sparrows like fishing trophies. Scientists who raised concerns were told to keep quiet. At least one ornithologist, Zheng Zuoxin, publicly argued that eliminating sparrows would cause ecological damage worse than the grain loss they caused. He was denounced as a rightist. He spent years in a labor camp. By the end of 1958, the Eurasian tree sparrow was functionally extinct across large portions of China. The campaign was declared a success. Mao was pleased. The party press ran triumphant headlines, and then a different kind of quiet settled over the countryside. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it, the absence of birds over farmland. It's a texture of sound that you don't notice until it's gone, and then the space it leaves behind feels wrong in a way you can't immediately articulate. Old farmers noticed. Some of them felt something close to dread, though they wouldn't have used that word. They recognized, in the particular stillness of their fields, that something load-bearing had been removed from the world they understood, what nobody in the central planning offices had accounted for, what nobody was allowed to account for, because accounting for it would imply that the chairman had made an error, was that sparrows don't only eat grain, they eat insects. Specifically, they eat locusts, they eat aphids, they eat the larvae of dozens of species that feed on exactly the same grain crops that the sparrows were supposedly destroying. A single sparrow might consume a few grams of grain seeds on a given day. That same sparrow eats hundreds of insects. Across 2 billion birds, year after year, that consumption had been quietly regulating insect populations at a continental scale for longer than human agriculture in China had existed. Remove 2 billion sparrows, and you don't have a landscape with slightly more grain and no birds. You have a landscape with exploding insect populations and nothing left to eat them. By the spring of 1959, the locusts came, not a modest increase, not a manageable uptick, swarms that moved like weather fronts. Fields of wheat that had survived everything, the campaign, the disruption, the compulsory labor diversions, were stripped in days. Aphids coated entire crops in a carapace of destruction. Farmers who had beaten their pots for hours killing sparrows now stood in those same fields, watching insects do precisely what the sparrows had supposedly been doing, except at a scale that no quota system had imagined. But this is the point in the story where ecology stops being the main character, because the insect explosion was catastrophic on its own, but it landed on top of something already broken. The Great Leap Forward had simultaneously collectivized farming across China. Millions of individual farmers, people who had spent their entire lives reading the specific soil, the specific drainage, the specific seasonal rhythms of their particular land, were folded into collective units that received instructions from officials who had never farmed anything. Those instructions were often bizarre in retrospect and deadly in practice. Crops were to be planted at a depth of 1 meter, based on a theory that denser, deeper planting would produce greater yields. The theory was wrong. Planting at that depth deprives roots of oxygen and kills the crop. This was implemented across millions of acres. Simultaneously, the drive to industrialize required steel. Steel required metal. Metal was collected from farms, tools, implements, cooking vessels, door hinges, and melted down in backyard furnaces that villages were required to build and operate. The furnaces burned day and night. Farmers were pulled from their fields to tend them. The steel they produced was so low in quality, too brittle, too impure, that it was useless for any actual industrial purpose. But the quota was the quota, and the quota showed tons produced, and the tons produced were reported as success. And then there was the numbers problem. Every level of Chinese government in 1958 and 1959 was under enormous pressure to report success. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's personal project. To report failure was to imply that Mao was wrong, which was to invite consequences that everyone at every level of the party apparatus understood very clearly. So local officials reported what was expected of them. Harvest yields were inflated, not slightly, not as a rounding error, but by multiples. A village that produced 100 tons of grain reported 300. A province that produced 1 million tons reported 5 million. Those fictional numbers traveled upward through the system and became the basis for national planning. The state then collected grain from each region based on those fictional yields. It collected grain that didn't exist, and it exported some of that grain to the Soviet Union because the trade agreements were the trade agreements, and the numbers said the grain was there. In villages across Anhui, Sichuan, Gansu, Qinghai, people were starving while official records showed bumper harvests. Farmers who tried to say that the numbers were wrong were accused of hiding grain, of counter-revolutionary sabotage. Some were beaten, some were imprisoned. The ones who stayed quiet watched their neighbors die. The famine that resulted from all of this, the Sparrow campaign, and the locust explosion it enabled, the collectivization and the bad planting methods and the steel drive and the falsified records and the grain exports, killed somewhere between 15 and 55 million people. The range is that wide because the records were falsified, because the deaths occurred in places too remote to count, because the Chinese government's official position for decades was that the famine was primarily a natural disaster. Droughts and floods, not policy, not the consequences of having removed 2 billion small birds from the food chain and then replaced honest farming with a quota system so sealed against reality that it could consume people and still report prosperity. The woman in Anhui who boiled her sandal strap is not a single person I can name. She's a composite of dozens of testimonies collected by historians decades later, when survivors were old enough and the political climate had shifted just enough that speaking was possible. Young Chang collected some of these accounts. Frank DeCutter spent years in Chinese provincial archives documenting what the party's own internal records showed. What survivors describe consistently across provinces and decades is not just hunger but a specific bewilderment, the feeling that the world had stopped following rules. People who had done everything correctly, had beaten their pots, had killed their sparrows, had met their quotas, had planted their crops at the prescribed depth, had reported the required numbers, and still watched their children die. They had done everything they were told. That was the problem. Mao did eventually acknowledge that the Sparrow campaign had been a mistake. In 1960, bedbugs replaced sparrows on the 4 pests list. The party announced this reversal in the tone of a minor administrative update, not an apology, not an accounting. By that point, in much of China, the sparrow population was so depleted that the revision was largely symbolic. You cannot undo 2 billion deaths with a policy memo. The ecological damage had already propagated through the system. The famine had already peaked. The bodies were already in the ground, or not in the ground, because in the worst affected areas, there weren't enough surviving people to bury the dead. The Soviet Union, which had its own reasons to understand what this kind of systemic failure looked like, reportedly became aware of the scale of the famine through its agricultural advisors in China. What they saw alarmed them enough to share it internally. The information that China was experiencing a famine of historic proportions reached Western governments through intelligence channels in the early 1960s. It was largely not reported, partly because of Cold War information dynamics, and partly because the Chinese government's denials were confident and the deaths were happening in places with no foreign journalists. The outside world didn't fully understand the scale of what had happened until the 1980s, when Chinese demographers began publishing analyses of census data, and the arithmetic became undeniable. There is a thing that happens inside systems, governments, corporations, institutions, sometimes families, where the certainty of the person or the ideology at the center metastasizes downward. It spreads through every layer of the structure until the question, but is this actually true, becomes functionally unthinkable. Not because the people in the system are stupid, often they're not. Not because they're purely cowardly, though fear is always part of it. But because the cost of asking the question is too high, and the machinery is already in motion, and everyone around you is already acting as if the thing is true. And at a certain point, it becomes genuinely easier to believe it than to face what honest accounting would mean. The sparrows weren't the story. The sparrows were the symptom. The story is a system so thoroughly insulated from honest feedback that it could eliminate 2 billion birds from an ecosystem, watch the ecosystem collapse in precisely the way the one silent scientist had predicted, watch tens of millions of people die, and still, at every level, in every report, in every headline, describe itself as succeeding. That is the thing worth holding. Not as a historical curiosity about a bizarre campaign in Mao's China, as a diagnostic tool you can apply to any system you're embedded in right now. What is the thing that everyone in your world is banging their pots to eliminate? What is doing a job nobody is allowed to ask about? What's the scientist in your Zhengzuoxin position, saying something inconvenient, being told to be quiet? Because the locusts always come. The question is only whether the birds are still there when they do. If you've got a candidate, a modern version of the sparrow campaign, subtle enough that most people aren't seeing it yet, I want to hear it in the comments, not the easy political answers. Those are too obvious, the structural ones. The ones where the pots are already being beaten and nobody's noticed the birds are getting quiet. Those are the conversations worth having. And if this kind of history is what you're here for, stay, there's more of it, and the next one goes somewhere you won't see coming.